Body snatching, the process of removing a fresh corpse from their grave, usually for the express purpose of selling it to medical schools for dissection, was a huge problem during the 17th to mid-19th century. The UK, Ireland, Netherlands, USA, Canada and India all had big problems with it. And while it wasn't technically illegal, as in there wasn't anything on the books about it at all, that doesn't mean the public weren't outraged. And oh boy, were they outraged. And they certainly took action. Just before we continue, please help out the channel by liking, sharing and subscribing. It really does mean a lot to all of us here. Now let's talk thwarting those body snatchers. Before we get into how those pesky body snatchers were thwarted, we need to know how they went about removing the dead in the first place. Let's face it, digging through 4 to 6 feet of soil, literally pulling out dead weight, all while not being noticed, doesn't sound like a pleasant evening. Now, if these body snatchers, or resurrectionists as they were called at the time, were smart and the option was available to them, they would pop on down to the local cemetery of the poor. These individuals had their coffins put in mass graves, and it wasn't completely covered until it was completely full. So these resurrectionists could simply come down at night, retrieve a body from the coffin, no digging required. But this option wasn't nearly as common as you would think. Usually they would observe a graveyard or cemetery during the day for fresh burials and then come back at night. They would dig a tunnel down to where the feet of the coffin would be. This was about 4 feet deep and just wide enough that the corpse's shoulders would fit through. Then they'd break into the coffin, which were usually made of pine wood at the time, so easy enough. Then tie a rope to the corpse's ankles and yank them out. Now, the reason these corpses needed to be so fresh was because A, the medical students needed them for dissection, so they need to be as close as possible to being alive. And B, once there was quite a bit of decomp going on, yanking out a corpse by his legs was only going to leave you with the legs, and you can't really sell that for a lot of profit. Now, I'm sure the thought of some immoral, money-hungry individuals pulling your family members out of their graves is a bit troubling. And the general public at the time thought no differently. Their means of stopping these body snatchers started simply enough and then progressed to the more elaborate as their frustrations grew. Now let's have a look. The lookout. This is the most basic plan. Have someone stay at the cemetery overnight for a few days to deter body snatchers. There are many accounts of people hiring someone to stand guard, but the problem with humans, especially humans that didn't know the deceased, is that they are partial to a bit of bribery. And as body snatching was a lucrative activity, they certainly had the money to pay off these hired people. So many families took it upon themselves to stand guard over the grave. However, while body snatchers couldn't take on a whole family, if there was only one person standing guard over the grave, certain body snatchers weren't opposed to creating another corpse and selling it too. After all, medical schools didn't ask questions about where these bodies were coming from. At the very least, spending multiple nights at a cemetery can't have been a pleasant thing for these family members to do. Watchtowers. Cemeteries themselves started fighting against body snatchers. Tall fences and walls were installed, something that may seem obvious now, but wasn't usually done back in the day. The public often added broken shards of glass and other nasty things to the walls to inhibit those trying to climb over them. Along with these walls, many cemeteries installed watchtowers, where paid cemetery guards would stand and look out over the cemetery, usually with a gun or a dog. The addition of these walls and fences did have some positive effect. However, watchmen were often asleep or drunk on duty and thus were less effective. Mort Safes. These were probably the most common way to prevent body snatching and can be seen in many parts of the world. They were iron cages placed over the grave and forced deep into the ground. Contrary to popular belief on the internet, they were not used to prevent the dead from rising as zombies. Everyone knows you have to remove a zombie's heart and burn it, or in the case of a vampire, stake it to the ground or remove its head and put it between its legs. Duh. Now, these things were extremely heavy, requiring several cemetery workers and a device known as the Mort Safe tackle just to lift the thing into place. So 2 or 3 body snatchers in the middle of the night with no real equipment had no hope of removing it. However, Mort safes were very expensive to buy, so many graveyards and parishes began to keep one or two on hand and rented them to families for £1 per day. After all, they didn't need to be there very long, just long enough that the body started to really decompose and was no longer of interest to medical schools. Then the coffin and the Mort safe would be dug up, the coffin reburied, and the Mort safe reused. Mort houses. Ah, a different sort of mort. Mort meaning death in French, by the way. As said before, dead bodies were only good for body snatching if they were fresh. So many large cemeteries at the time set up buildings where multiple dead bodies could be stored for a few days each until they had decomposed enough to not be tempting. The idea being that a solid building was easier to lock and guard than multiple graves. Now, not all cemeteries had these facilities, so many families, bearing in mind that home wakes were perfectly normal and very common thing to do at the time, would keep their deceased loved ones at home a few extra days until they were a bit ripe before having them buried. Coffin collars. Coffin collars were an iron bar in a U shape placed around the deceased's neck and fastened to the base of the coffin. With the usual way of removing a body being to haul it out by its feet, coffin collars ensured that if they wanted to be successful at removing the whole body, they would need to break up the base of the coffin at the end where the head was, which was a huge amount of effort, and body snatchers usually gave up. It was quite a simple but very effective means of deterrent. Iron caskets. Coffins back in the day were made of simple pine wood, and obviously they were very easy to break into. So many inventors and companies over the period started to create various types of iron caskets. Some were body shaped, some were simply an iron box, some had sprint catches to keep the lid firmly closed, but they all did the same thing. These iron caskets were only for the richest of the rich. A regular pine coffin would have cost about £2 at the time, but a lead casket cost about £100, so that's quite a price difference there. And they didn't really take off because usually the rich were already using the next option. Mausoleums. This kind of above ground entombment we have seen throughout history for nobility and the rich, and it was no different during the 17th to 19th century. Their main purpose was, quite frankly, to show off. But during this period, they also proved very effective at thwarting body snatchers. Doors and windows were often barred, vaults were glued shut. A lot of mausoleums were better constructed than the houses that most people were living in at the time, which says a lot. Symmetry guns. Okay, so they didn't get creative with the name, but for a time they were very effective. It was a gun mounted to the foot of the grave that could rotate 360 degrees. The gun was rigged with a thin tripwire to catch thieves entering at night. When someone tripped on the wire, the gun would swing in their direction and fire. Again, these were very expensive to buy and were mostly just rented for a week. Unfortunately, body snatchers soon cottoned on to this and would send females to pose as mourners to the graveyard to visit during the daytimes and see which families had paid for cemetery guns. This way they could avoid those locations at night, so the cemetery gun didn't last long. Coffin torpedo. While body snatching had subsided in Europe by the early 1800s, the USA was a bit slower to find an answer, and the public by now had gone from frustrated to wanting revenge. In 1878 Ohio, Philip K. Clover patented the Coffin Torpedo. He very frankly explained that this invention was fully intended to kill or seriously injure any grave robber who was trying to steal a dead body. The Coffin Torpedo would sit on the lid of the buried coffin and work much like a shotgun, firing lead balls at whoever tried to dig up the coffin. While it didn't necessarily stop body snatchers from attempting to do their thing, it certainly punished them when they did. There are many stories of men dying or having their legs blown off by these things. Legality. But in the end, the ultimate deterrent for body snatching was to simply make it no longer profitable. In 1832, the UK passed the Autonomy Act, which gave license to medical schools to use donated bodies for science. Now, if you're thinking what I'm thinking, just how many people were donating their body to science back then? Allow me to clear that up. What it actually meant was that a body could be used if a family didn't object, which gave them legal access to corpses who went unclaimed after death. In particular, corpses who had died in hospital, prison, or the workhouse. And there were a hell of a lot of those going around. Other countries in Europe quickly followed, It took a bit longer for the USA, with body snatching not really coming to an end until embalming became a big deal in the 1880s, allowing bodies to be stored longer. Unfortunately, in some countries like India, body snatching never stopped. Certainly not to the same extent that it did back then, but it still occurs today. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe if you did. If you would like to see a video on modern day body snatching, please let us know in the comments. I think it could be a good one. Now, thanks for watching from Gary and I. Now go talk death.